So, Frencel, here we are again, sitting down to talk about a book, but not the book that we spoke about earlier. You now have written a new book, which is available for pre-ordering. We'll chat about that later. But again, Frencel, and I've obviously read the little bits that you've allowed me to see. And I am exceptionally excited about reading the book, but not just about reading the book, about what the book means. Because you have addressed, as with your last book, Wisdom That Builds, your new book addresses a different part of the life cycle of business. And you've gone very deliberately for what you call the mid-market. And that mid-market is in many ways almost, I'm going to say schizophrenic, because there are many different companies that at different times in their life cycle move in and out of that market in terms of their personality, even though their turnover or revenue might classically be seen as mid-market. And we're going to explore in this very short session we're going to have today a couple of the ideas that you broach in the book. But what I'd like you to start with is say, okay, what is the mid-market further than just the classic definition of this revenue to that revenue? What defines a business? You look at a business and you say, okay, this is really, truly a mid-market situation.
Yeah, no, thanks, Michael, and it's good to be back with you and to talk about this book. So yeah, I guess with the mid-market, perhaps the one aspect that is common is that many of the businesses are founder-led. So you've got a very strong founder that has started a business maybe a few years back, or maybe they, have been in this business for a couple of, decades and are now grappling with different challenges as the business have grown. And the way I started thinking about this issue is that, getting into the coaching space for the last year or so, coming from a consulting perspective, I realized that I've actually worked alongside a number of founders. In my investment holding private equity days, both as an FD, but then also at one point I was working alongside another founder-led business that was in the mid-market, and this business was also investment holding company, but I was in a different capacity. I was now the CIO in that business. And these two businesses have got different sizes. The one is much larger than the other. In my consulting days, I've also, which I'm still doing, I've worked with other founder-led businesses more in a consulting capacity, and some of those was much smaller. So the problems are not the same, right? They're different challenges, but there's a central theme in all of these businesses, that they are founder-led, and the founder deals with various, I would say, psychological aspects, the internal world of the founder, which I realized are not often discussed. When you think about the discussion that might be in the public discourse, if you go on social media or you go on professional forums, there's a lot of talk about scaling up. And in the process of writing this book, I've obviously looked at my own experience. I've also looked at other literature, people writing about scaling up. I've also looked at, books on strategy, leadership, execution, and so on. And I try to kind of, to present a case, a thesis in the book that is both, it talks to the realities of what these businesses face, without getting to a point where it's only about framework. So I do discuss frameworks in the book as well. I do discuss, strategy, leadership, and so on. But I wanted to understand exactly what are the challenges that these businesses face, and what are the things that you need to do to then bridge those. So from a kind of a technical standpoint in South Africa, the mid-market is defined as companies with revenue between 30 million and 1.5 billion. That's what business, the investment banks would say to you if you ask them. What I've realized as well, Michael, is that if you look at South Africa, but I think this is a worldwide phenomenon, that about 98% of businesses, if not more, never get to the 30 million. So if you consider that, there's a lot of discussion around SMEs, which are important and good. A lot of focus on SME incubators, on how to start a business and so on. But I don't think there's a lot of discussion in a holistic manner about how to grow a business that not only grows in size, but also grows in being an asset as opposed to just a job. And I've seen different manifestations of that. People have a business that are of size, but the business is still very much, it's not a liquid or transferable asset. And that's the theme that I'm going through. So what I'm trying to do in the book is, combine, the theoretical aspect, the academic, the kind of research aspect with real life examples and then practical frameworks to say, okay, fine, these are some of the things that I see, and this is perhaps the things that you need to think about. As a entrepreneur, as a founder, to build a business that thrives throughout the mid-market development, but also beyond that, and actually becomes an attractive asset for investors.
And I think you've mentioned something there that bears taking a step back. And I love when I read your books, like I did with the first one. I sit with my telephone near me and I keep on photographing. I read this on Kindle, and I read the previous book on Kindle as well. So I'll photograph the screen and I'll share it. And I think you mentioned here transferability is a test of value. I love the one-liners that you have. And this is what you're talking about really here, is that transferability. Do you have an asset that has value in itself that can be transferred? And I think one of the important questions that is very seldom not asked by a founder, and it's one of the foundational questions that I ask when I enter into a coaching relationship with a client in a different market segment to the one that you're talking about, is why are you building this business? Because I normally get involved in either the turnaround or the startup phase of businesses. And I say, what is your intention? Are you building an asset that you want to manage and hand over to your children to manage? Or are you building an asset to sell? And it's important that one asks those questions. Now, you talk about three paths that a business is on. And particularly in that mid-market, those three paths are vitally important. Because if you are not even aware of which path you're on, which is the unfortunate thing, the chances of you having a scalable and transferable or monetizable asset, even though you may be generating revenue, the chances of you ever realizing the value that should be there are remote. Those three paths, I think, sum up where the business needs to have the, you spoke about your Nebuchadnezzar moment in your first book, but where they need to look at the writing on the wall and say, okay, which path am I on? Am I on the path that I need to be on? What are those three paths, Frencel?
No, thanks, Michael. And again, you look, the best ideas, I'm sure you would agree, the best ideas are simple. They're not, anyone could have observed that, with a little bit of reflection. So some of the things that I came up with it was part of the writing process. As I reflected and tried to make things memorable and looked at what I saw. So the three parts, which also correlates with what I talk about, three parts of growth, right? And then I talk about sort of three choices that the founders have. So they kind of related, and maybe we can get into the embellish a little bit about the kind of three parts of growth, but there are some overlaps. So when I talk about the choices that the founder makes, is that I talk about build to sell, then I talk about build to steward, and then I talk about build by default. Now, how did I come up with that? So as I was writing the book, I looked obviously at looking to find examples in my own life, in my own career, and then also in what's happening in the public space, because I think it's important that when we address our audiences, the information is kind of live, and it's in front of mind. So there were two transactions that were happening around the time that I was just finalizing the book, and I thought, look, these are as you write and rewrite, these are excellent examples to use. So the one example was the disposal of a business by a man called Nathan Kirsch, I think his name is, who has got this big cash and carry business in the US. And he was now selling this business for a ridiculous amount of money. I think at $39 billion. So that's the one example that happened. And then there was another example here in South Africa of a beverage business. And this man was now selling his business after about 20 years of building this beverage business. So he was competing with with the I suppose the main brands, beverage brands, but doing it in a different way, targeting a different LSM, so to speak. So for me, then as I was thinking about this, then these two frameworks started developing. The build to steward, similar to one could think about Warren Buffett. He's built his business. He's 90 years old. He's not sold. He's obviously gotten a lot of cash out of the business, dividends out of it, and paper wealth and the likes. And that was kind of the example of this man who build his business. He always had this option because he was building the structure in his business, the strategy, the governance, leadership aspect, which I also talk about in the book. So he had all of these, but he wasn't necessarily pressed to sell. He's now towards the end of his life. He could have potentially, transferred the business to maybe his second generation of his children and so on. But he decided to sell the business. So that's what I'm talking about, build to steward. It's a multi he's been building this for over many decades. Then the build to sell business is someone who realized that growth and enterprise value, which I talk about a lot in the book, is not the same thing. So you can have a business that's growing, but it's not making enough profits or cash that can attract a reasonable valuation from an investor that sees that this is not just about a one-man structure. This is a proper business that actually has a growth thesis. And so this gentleman, I think his name is Ken Clark, he then built this business and then sold it to a company called Varun Beverages. So I include those examples, and I try to paint a story throughout the book with similar concepts. So the readers introduce the concept, and then it kind of expands to that. Then I sort of said to myself, look, that's great. Those guys have done well, and we'll talk about how they got there. But the one model that I found personally in my career more prevalent in the mid-market now is the build by default. So in other words, a person starts a business, he's heard about scaling up, or he's maybe not even heard about that. He's just, gifted as an entrepreneur, and he builds this business, and it becomes of scale. He's got a team. I've worked with one company comes to mind where the business already had quite a big staff complement. It had a few, manufacturing plants, and it had reasonable revenue. It was not at the bottom of the mid market. It was now kind of a company with reasonable revenue, but it wasn't necessarily profitable. And It didn't have options. So for me, that's kind of a model of built by default. It's kind of, look, we're growing, we're opportunistic still. And it's not the only model. It's not the only example. There's more examples. And so that's what I mean. So my challenge to the reader, and this is also what I hope people will get out of the book, is to say, look, where am I? Where am I now in my path? Am I built to sell? Am I built to steward? Am I building by default? Um, do I actually want to build to steward? In other words, I want to grow beyond the mid-market even. I want maybe one day to be a public company. But if I want to get there, then it means that I have to look at where my business is now. What are the disciplines in my business that I need to amend and change? And that's the other point I'm making in the book, is that a lot of focus in talking about strategy or talking about scaling up is around the conceptual arguments. It's around the MBA stuff, if you can put it that way. Not many books actually turn the lens around and say, what do I have to do as Mr. Founder? What are the things that I need to do? You see, so the whole entire book, and this is maybe a little bit of a link to the previous book, but the entire book is written with the audience in mind. It's not just about sharing concepts. It's about, how do I empower the reader to see his own situation in the book and apply these concepts I'm sharing with. Many of them are not necessarily completely new concepts, but it's just from a different angle.
And I think, Frencel, one of the things that in the time that you and I have known each other, I've noticed how important that emotional quotient, we call it EQ, the maturity, how vital that is, particularly from a founder, because very often the hustle and the energy of the founder gets translated into the culture of those around him, into a type of arrogance. And we see companies in the South African concept, I can think of two major retail groups. One of the keys to sustainability of a business of that size, as you point out already in Wisdom That Builds, it comes across clearly as a theme. And if someone hasn't read that book, it's a good book to go back and read. But you talk about the founder's paradox, where the founder's greatest strengths eventually can become the business's greatest liabilities. Could you just delve into that a little bit?
Yeah, so in the Wisdom That Builds, I talk about the brilliance and the brokenness of a founder. In this book, I didn't specifically talk about that in that way, but I talk about in the second chapter, which is where I talk about why businesses stall, and I call it the founder's constraint. So I have an entire chapter about that, about the founder's constraint and how a lot of it is psychological. It's an internal shift that needs to be made. So I do dedicate, a lot of it about that. And I think in the 8th chapter, if my memory serves me correct, I talk about leadership. And again, I contextualize, because, you can talk about leadership in a very generic sense, because there's a lot of books on leadership. What I talk about here is in the context of founder-led businesses. And one of the things I also talk about when I talk about the leadership, in the leadership chapter, is about building a leadership system. Not only one individual, because that also talks to value. Because an investor coming into the business wants to obviously invest in a corpus of leadership, a cadre of leaders, right? So one of the things I talk about there is around the loyalty bias. So I say, a couple of the things that hold founders back is what I call the founder's trap, which is everything is centralized around the founder. And another one, which I talk about, is what I call the loyalty bias. So when you employ people, when you manage them, and that comes through obviously in family business as well, you have this thing called the loyalty bias, and those are some of the things I talk about there. But to answer your question directly and linking it to the wisdom that builds, in that book I referenced, Steve Jobs, and I spoke about how he was brilliant and but again, with every um, strong quality, there's also a dark element, and how that ended up being getting into micromanagement and controlling people, and the culture was affected, and obviously not necessarily open to new ideas. And of course, he went through his own transition, and he came back a stronger person, and we saw what happened with Apple. So those are some of the lessons that I share in the first book. But in this one, I actually do talk about how what I call the founder's constraint, where the growth of the business is linked to the founder. For example, one of the things I talk about in chapter 2 is personal ambition. So I say that we spoke earlier about this build to sell, build to steward, and build to by default. So the concepts I'm introducing in the book are all linked. They're all linked to the one central idea of building this transferable business. So I'm saying now, okay, fine, we spoke about in chapter 1 about these three different routes, right? Now, one of the things for you to get to that route is to deal with some of these internal, what's happening internally. And in that context, personal ambition is important. So if your ambition is to build a small business that provides for you, gives you the flexibility, you don't have to have this whole governance structure around you, and that's your choice. That's fine. It's a perfectly reasonable choice. But if you want to get to the build to steward or build to sell, it means your ambition has to align with what you're trying to build. And then I make a subsequent point, which I say the psychological cost of actually getting there. So I'm saying, okay, fine, if that's your ambition, then be aware there's a psychological cost, because now for you to get to the build to sell, build to steward model, it means you're going to not be the only person in the business. You're going to involve other people. At some point, you may have to engage a formal board structure. And I'll talk about governance as well in the book. But that means that you're going to have to now deal with a different set of variables, which has a psychological cost to it. So I think for me, that's what I try to do with the book, Michael, is to obviously we're all learning. I'm not saying I've now written the final book on this aspect, but the point is, for me, it was important to be authentic. So while speaking only about strategy and about financial reporting, which I do in the book, about business model, which I do in the book, if you didn't holistically deal with the key constraint, which is really the founder, then I don't think you've presented a complete thesis, which is what I try to do.
And I think, Frencel, this is one of the reasons that I loved your first book and what you have allowed me to read out of this book. That emotional intelligence again, that maturity that comes through, and the understanding that at the base of things are people.
Yes.
And in our business, it is something that we very often sit back and look at, and we say, what effect does this have on the people that are going to be affected by this decision? How do we ensure that what we want and what they want is aligned? Because if we create alignment, one doesn't work as hard, you reduce friction.
Yeah.
And sometimes you want to create friction intentionally, but then realize you're doing it. And to me, that is one of the greatest joys in reading your work, is that it is not a clinical exploration of business. There are plenty of textbooks that do that. But that connection between business and almost seeing the business as an extension of the humans that are part of it is what makes your book and books, and I'm hoping that there are more after this one. I know this is a monster. How many pages did you eventually finish on, Frencel?
Yeah, so I wrote and rewrote the book about 10 times, to be honest with you. So went about each chapter, some key ideas, and then so eventually I ended up with about 360 pages. But I have to qualify that. So I decided to then put all my diagnostics. So each chapter, well, 8 of the 11 chapters, um, I had diagnostics. So there's a combination of kind of more the psychological, internal, meditative stuff, reflective, thinking and so on. And then the more kind of how to type stuff. So I have 8 of the chapters, I have diagnostics. And so I realized then, look, the diagnostics breaks a little bit the flow of each chapter because I try to write the book more in a narrative so that it's more enjoyable. So I then put the diagnostics at the back of the book. So long story short, the book proper is about 300 pages, 310 or so. And then there's another 52 pages or so of diagnostics, which I hope, the readers will use so that it's not just a sharing of ideas, but you can do a bit of assessment as to where you are in the different disciplines.
So I think what I'm going to say at this stage is the questions that we have addressed today, we haven't got through even half of what I would have liked to have got through.
Sure.
And this is only based on chapter 1.
Yeah.
So this is an exceptionally powerful conversation to continue. And I know that you and I have planned, as we do, to have this as part of a series. So we will continue having these conversations, releasing the videos and the audio as we have these conversations. So there's a lot to look forward to for the audience on both sides. And I'm looking forward to our next chat. At this stage, your launch date is set for May the...
Yeah, the 25th. I understand it's Africa Day, so I thought it's an interesting day to launch it on. I am bringing out, hopefully not too distant future, a page called the Growth Illusion.Africa, which I will then take the readers into confidence in one of the chapters. So that's what I'm planning to do. And I think these conversations are really helpful. What I liked is that, we did talk about chapter 1, but in a way we also talked about some of the other aspects of the book. And it just encourages me because the conversation was so flowing, which means that I hope that that's how the reader experiences the book. It's not a MBA kind of study. It's sort of a narrative around the idea that I'm putting forward, which is that growth doesn't necessarily relate to value. And I'm also putting the idea for that growth is not a linear progression. Because in the book, in chapter 1, I talk about 3 parts of growth, which is the growth that unravels. So you start growing, but then things don't actually go where you want to. And then, I also talk about growth that builds value. And unfocused growth as well is the first category. So you can even have so the second category, I talk about growth that unravels. Obviously, confidentiality and so on. I try to look at types. So some of the examples are mentioned by name, right? I mentioned 2 already in this conversation, but the other examples, when I talk about unfocused growth and I talk about growth that unravels, it is actually based on observations of companies that I've worked with. But obviously, I don't mention the company by name. I mention the pattern that I've seen there. And all that to say is that I think what's missing sometimes in the conversation when people talk about growth is this assumption that growth is a linear thing. You start a business and then it just keeps on growing. And no, it doesn't. It can stall, then go backward. It can actually completely unravel as well. if you don't have the right disciplines in your business and the personal transformation as the founder, which is what I'm saying.
And I think these, Frencel, are subjects that we're going to explore in further conversations. And I see us coming back to some of these to reinforce, because one of the things of learning is to constantly revisit with new perspective. And we will start looking at other topics that you bring in. It's a very topical book. It's a very, I think the time is right for it. We are at an inflection point in history. We are at an inflection point in geopolitics, in economics. So there are many questions that founders need to be asking themselves. And I think your book is ideally positioned to help people through that process. So up until the 25th of May, we are going to continue this journey. I know that you are very active on LinkedIn, so people can look you up on LinkedIn, and it's just Frencel Gillion on
Frencel Gillion
on LinkedIn. And obviously you have your website at primeracapital.co.za. So those are probably the two best places to connect with you.
100%. And I've also got a YouTube channel, but I share from time to time content on there. Thank you for this conversation. I think it's really been thoughtful. It's been you're a very good interviewer. So, conversationalist, and I think I'm hoping that people who watch the interview, the appetite is stirred for reading the book, and I look forward to future conversations.
Frencel, it's always a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you very much. We'll chat next week.
Thanks so much, Michael.